Everyone, welcome. My name's Welcome, everyone. My name's Ethan. I'm the resident fellow here at the Free Peoples of Russia House. The Free Peoples of Russia House is a Russian opposition organization, cultural center, and think tank. And today we have speaking Mr. Eugene Chu. Eugene is a retired U.S. Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel who did overseas deployments in South Korea, Iraq, and Poland. Following his military retirement, he served as an authority coordinator for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative at the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. He holds an undergraduate degree in political science and a graduate degree in business from Texas Christian University. His academic coursework features Chinese history, international business law, and Russian foreign policy. His professional and personal experience include travel to Europe, mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. He remains actively engaged in advocacy for Ukraine, including participation in the Ukraine Action Summits in Washington, D.C., and currently studies Ukrainian language. So, thank you for coming and speaking, Mr. Chu.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Everybody comfortably seated? Okay. Thank you. Good evening. As mentioned, I'm Eugene Chu, and tonight, Deterrence, Precedent, and Power, I'm here to talk about the connection between the current ongoing conflict of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a potential future conflict involving China and Taiwan. And for my agenda, I think I can skip this part because Ethan did a great job of mentioning my biography. I also wanted to mention some deterrence quotes from different leaders, along with understanding Chinese and Russian history, specifically their ties, along with explaining what Taiwan is for those who don't really have that much knowledge, along with understanding how, for all those parties involved, it's mixed support. And I also want to be able to explain perspectives because there is a connection, but a future conflict between China and Taiwan will be different than what's going on currently in Russia and Ukraine, and understanding power. I'm going to make sure that I have question and answer time for all of you in the audience. Thank you all for coming. Family, friends, students, supporters of Ukraine and Taiwan, opponents of Putin and Xi. Now, I'll probably just skip this one, but however, like mentioned, I am retired military. I have my degrees as mentioned, and picture my handsome face from 2023. Yep, but however, for my work, this was me doing a 5K last year to raise funds for United Help Ukraine. And for my Ukraine, proud to have both Ukraine Russians who have gone with me to Capitol Hill as part of our group to try to talk to Congress in order to continue support during these difficult times. Now, deterrence quotes. Various media headlines. When I mean by various media, I'm talking about not just traditional mainstream media, but also independent media and social media. Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow, Ukraine 今天, Taiwan 明天. All right, thank you. Comes from forgetting a lot of it from speaking too much English. But however, I also want to mention that a few quotes. Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's former president, a Ukrainian victory today will serve as the most effective deterrent to future aggression. They are seeing a connection right now between Europe and Asia. Xie Jiesheng, Taiwan's general and deputy chief of staff for intelligence, if Russia defeats Ukraine, it will embolden China's moves towards Taiwan, and Taipei hopes that Kyiv emerges victorious. It's not just what's on paper, it's not just what's in logically, emotionally, a Russian victory and Ukrainian defeat, that would unfortunately boost mainland Chinese morale and weaken Taiwan's morale. And last but not least, I got this from an editorial article by Lieutenant Colonel Brian Kirk. He's an active duty U.S. Marine Corps officer. He specifically mentioned deprioritizing Ukraine will lead to its defeat and set conditions for the United States to face a future two-front war against an emboldened China and reconstituted Russia. I'm reading these quotes because I'm trying to emphasize how, bless you, you're fine, how the connections are on multiple fronts, and that the people who believe in these connections are, again, from media, from politics, and from the military, both in Taiwan and in the US. Now, history of Chinese and Russian ties as precedent. Yep, come on in, sir. You're fine. Yep. I'm going to be taking a minute to talk about Chinese and Russian history because it's not just the last few years or even the last few decades. It's important to know that Chinese and Russian ties, and the background for this, go back over a century. First and foremost, understanding their history, final monarchical dynasties. Both China and Russia had royal families up until the 1910s, but unfortunately, those monarchies fell apart. As mentioned on the slide, national humiliations. Russia lost a war with Japan and unfortunately had to give up land along with dealing with the embarrassment of that war in the late 1800s. And for China, they had to deal with the Opium Wars, in which they lost and they had to forfeit Hong Kong to Britain, and later on they had to forfeit Taiwan to Japan. I'll tell you more about Taiwan and Japan in a little bit. And furthermore, like you see, economic decline. Because of that, it got worse for both countries. For Russia, normally a war provides a temporary boost to your economy, but however, for World War I, it actually drained the Russian treasury and caused a grain shortage over there, which unfortunately caused uprising among the people, understandably. And for China, because of imperialism, understand what it means. Normally, when you're in a country, the government and it's in your own businesses are setting conditions for trade and for customs. Because of imperialism, you had other countries that were dictating trade and customs for their benefit in an exploitive manner. And unfortunately, both monarchies got overthrown in revolutions. For China, it was the revolution of 1911. For Russia, it was 1917. And while both monarchies abdicated, they were both willing to give up. Unfortunately, it was not enough. For Russia, the Romanov dynasty, they died due to violent execution. The whole family got shot by firing squad. For China, the last emperor, Puyi, what happened for his case, he bounced around as a puppet emperor between multiple different foreign powers for much of his life. And then later on, he spent time in a Chinese re-education camp before eventually being freed. But however, he died as a simple gardener due to cancer in 1967. And I also want to emphasize something else for historical reference. Both countries transitioning to communism, it did not happen overnight. It happened over decades, and it was due to civil wars in World War II. An important note. Chinese and Russian civil wars are similar because they both involved the communists and the nationalists. For the Russians, it was the Bolsheviks, which people nicknamed the Reds, and the nationalists they nicknamed the Whites. For the Chinese, they had their Communist Party, and their nationalist party was called the Kuomintang. I mention this as difference because the American Civil War, it was a group of states that broke away to try to go back under Confederate times. And for Ireland, after they gained independence from the UK, there was a treaty, and the Civil War was from two different factions that said, this treaty is acceptable, let's take it, and others are saying, no, we need to continue further. But getting back to the point, both of them had their own civil wars, and the West supported those civil wars on the national side for Russia and for China. And then for World War II, both the Soviet Union and the Republic of China, because after the emperor got overthrown, there was a republic, they both fought on the side of the Allies against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. I also want to emphasize something else. The West, they advised the Chinese nationalists, for those of you who have an urge to play with your phone, which is look up the name Joseph Stilwell. He was a famous U.S. Army general who did not get along with Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese nationalists. And then also, the Soviets, they advised the Chinese communists, and if you want an example, if you want to look on your phone now or later on, there is a fictional Chinese TV series called My Natasha. Again, it's fiction, but it was about a female Chinese commissar who fell in love with a male Chinese guerrilla leader during World War II, but unfortunately, they had to break up due to bad politics. Yep. However, I also want to mention, what you see for the bullet points, the Soviet Union and China transitioning to communism, there were a few notable differences. For the Soviets, it happened earlier during the 1920s because they had a one-and-done civil war. For China, their civil war was two-part. It began before World War II. After Japan invaded, both the communists and nationalists put aside their differences to mutually fight Japan, and then afterwards, they restarted their conflict. So another note. For the Russian Civil War, the white side, the nationalist side, they broke apart and they ran because they unfortunately lost and there was no sanctuary for them. For Taiwan, thanks to the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet, they moved to Taiwan. As an analogy, for those who, for comparison, imagine if Kaliningrad in Europe was not part of the Soviet Union or Russia, but instead had become a government in exile for the whites. Again, hypothetical, but just to understand for comparison how different they were in terms of the transition. And during the late 1940s to the 1950s, they were actually on very good terms. Mao Zedong visited the Soviet Union both during Stalin's time and during Khrushchev's time, and Khrushchev visited twice during the 1950s. And during 1950, they also signed their first treaty. One of their first combined efforts was the Korean War. To clarify, Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, was an ally of the Soviet Union. He started the war, but however, he did have Soviet weaponry and equipment provided for aid. Later on, China jumped in because what had happened was North Korea initially pushed South Korea and the West down, and after they were able to amass a counteroffensive, which pushed through North Korea to the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. China sent in troops to push the Allies back to the 38th parallel where the war started. I also want to mention there were a couple of 1956 poster quotes that I found when looking on Google. You see a couple of different posters, both up and down. The Soviet Union today is like our tomorrow. The Soviet Union is the best friend of the Chinese. At the time, during the 1950s, they had very warm relations. They were nearly best buds. And also, the Great Leap Forward in China, which was an agricultural disaster where they tried to consolidate and use a bunch of Soviet science, it was actually inspired by the 5-year plans that were in the Soviet Union. However, although they were on good terms at first, to quote from Taylor Swift, there would later be bad blood. Yep. Later on, they would have the Sino-Soviet split during the 1960s and 70s. To clarify, it didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual change. And you could do a whole 1-hour college lecture on it, but just to summarize it for sake of simplicity, the first reason, ideological rifts in communism. China had more of an agricultural focus and rural focus for communism, while the Soviet Union still had an emphasis on industry. And furthermore, there were other issues that got involved. For example, you had to deal with disagreements about foreign policy. During Khrushchev's time, the Cuban Missile Crisis, China, Mao Zedong, thought he was backing down and was actually getting soft. And détente, they were wondering and worried, is the Soviet Union getting weak? Are they going to collaborate with the West and turn on us? And then also, aid details and relations. The Soviet Union and China did collaborate together, but however, based upon a lot of those disagreements and China not wanting to do things 100% the Soviet way, one of the biggest issues with nuclear weapons, the Soviets started helping China with nuclear weapons, but then because of all this, they stopped and China developed them on their own. And furthermore, despite all that talk in the 1950s, how the Soviet Union is our best friend, they felt more and more like the Soviet Union was treating them more in an exploitive manner rather than on near equal terms. And then also, border disputes. Quick note from Chinese history, I'm not just going to quickly touch on it, but parts of Siberia during the 1600s belonged to the Mongols, Genghis Khan, in his time, and also in the 1800s, parts of the far east of Siberia were actually Chinese territory. They voluntarily gave it up to the Imperial Russians for help during the Opium Wars, excuse me. But unfortunately, Russia ended up reneging after they saw how their military was unfortunately outclassed by the West. And as a result, things started turning violent. 1968's Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. To clarify, in 1968, there were a bunch of protests in Czechoslovakia, and the Warsaw Pact was the communist counterpart to NATO. Czechoslovakia was a member nation, and the Soviets led other member nations to crush those protests. China saw that as a threat. They saw them as unreliable. Hey, they're going to attack one of their fellow member nations. They're not an ally. And also a famous 1969 battle. One island claimed by both China and the Soviet Union, the Chinese called it Zhengbao, the Soviets called it Damansky, and there actually was a brief, literal, bloody battle in which a little less than 100 Soviet soldiers and a little less than 100 Chinese soldiers got killed or wounded. China and the Soviet Union avoided war narrowly because at the time, both of them were supporting North Vietnam because for those who remember the American-Vietnam War, Vietnam was getting support from both of them, and the Vietnamese were talked them down by saying, we need you to cooperate together because we're fighting the West. But however, they were no longer on speaking terms. And then for those who remember American history about Richard Nixon going to China, one reason why he went to China, he was trying to leverage them as an ally against the Soviet Union, and also because of the Sino-Soviet split, it seemed like the conditions were ripe in order to talk to Mao for leverage. Now, there'd be some additional violence, but eventually relations would thaw out and normalize. China, to clarify, it supported the West because during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Chinese actually supported both providing weapons to the Mujahideen, and also China has a small border with Afghanistan, and they cut off access to that border to the Soviets. Again, while the West and Pakistan were doing the heavy lifting, but however, to be truthful, China was contributing weapons and equipment to the Mujahideen. And later on, even though China and the Soviet Union worked together to help North Vietnam take over South Vietnam, however, China would invade Vietnam in 1979 because what happened was Vietnam invaded Cambodia, a Chinese ally, and China wanted to teach them a lesson, so to speak. And based upon this time period, even though the Soviets did not physically intervene, but they still tried to send what little material aid that they could, and they performed their own border control with their overseas troops during that conflict. However, even though things still got rough in the early 80s, by the mid-80s, things started changing. Like mentioned on the bullet point, the Soviet Union, they would start their policy, glasnost and perestroika. For China, Deng Xiaoping started the policy of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and they would change their economies from command government focus towards slow outside privatization. And then, just to clarify, they slowly started a gradual process of normalization. It was not one meeting or even one summit, but it was a series of back and forth summits. Yes. Oh, joking. Yep. A series of back and forth summits. Between the both of them during the mid-'80s to reopen up. And for those of you who remember world history, 1989, Tiananmen Square's famous massacre, and in 1991, the August coup in the newly formed Russian Federation. And on a caveat side note, the day before Tiananmen Square, Russia's Mikhail Gorbachev signed normalization papers with China's Deng Xiaoping. To clarify, normalization. It does not mean that they were friends, but they were at least on speaking terms again. They were at least recognizing each other for sake of diplomacy as countries. And just to sum it up, during the 1990s, China still was not a power, but it was growing, it was slowly developing itself economically. And for Russia, it was a time of chaos. There was a lot of mass migration because of the slow rise of oligarchy rule and growing crime and instability. However, things would continue to change and warm up later on. After the turn of the millennium, China and the Russian Federation signed a new treaty in 2001. It was initially for 20 years, but however, during the pandemic, it got extended, and now the new date is 2027. And the major topics, I'm not going to read off of the whole line, but you can understand the normal things that countries would talk about. Let's just science, tech, the economy, trade, and finance. Just the normal thing, because again, when countries need to cooperate with each other in order to improve their own well-being and their own stability. But two major points: Russia's official stance. China's official stance is that Taiwan is not autonomous or independent, but that it is a province of theirs. That treaty, which Russia signed, said in writing, we acknowledge that. And furthermore, bilateral military cooperation. Since the signing of that treaty, Russia and China have done some combined military exercises together, and they have done some occasional combined military operations together. There have been a few instances in which some people have been concerned about Chinese and Russian air patrols getting close to certain neighbors' borders. And also, 9/11. After September 11th, after the radical Islamic group Al-Qaeda destroyed the World Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon, Russia and China, in order to try to legitimize their violence, they were saying, oh, we're also involved in helping you, United States, because these Chechen minority people, they're Muslims, they've conducted acts, so they used it as a reason to conduct repressive actions. And the Uyghurs over in China, they also did the same thing over there based upon 9/11. Now, some of you know about Taiwan, some of you don't. I want to quickly provide some information for those who don't. Understanding some Taiwan basics. First, it's an archipelago. I say the word archipelago because, well, you see that big island over there on the picture? It's more than just that big island. There are also a bunch of small islands around there as well that are part of Taiwan's territory. And then just to clarify, it's very mountainous. There are very few beaches. There's very little farmland. And even though there are small villages, well, a lot of their cities are extremely dense. As an example, think about how New York and London are very compact just because of limited land space and the need to be able to house so many people, businesses, and other government buildings. Again, just to understand that. And then demographics. To clarify, Russia and China have similar demographic ratios because, as an analogy, the dominant race in China, are Han Chinese, and there are a bunch of little minority groups over there as well. Hakkas, Manchus, Uyghurs, and so forth. But again, just to understand, over 90% are Hans, but they're a scattering of minorities. And then also for Russia, the dominant race over in Russia has been the white Slavs, but there are also little ethnic minorities there as well. For example, the aforementioned Chechens. You also have the Tatars, the Buryats, and a bunch of other groups that escape me. But again, they got a sprinkling over there, even though the dominant ethnic group over there has been Slavs. And also, when it comes to Taiwan, you've got, you've got a mix over there because there are some Han Chinese, there are some ethnic minorities there, and there have been some natives there, just like you have Native Americans here in the U.S. And just a quick rundown and recap over diplomatic ties. From 1945 to 1971, it was actually recognized as China by the UN, and as of right now, it doesn't really hold an official seat. While it still competes in, let's say, international competitions, let's say the Olympics, they compete under China Taipei due to the fact that they're trying to, Chinese Taipei, thank you for clarifying, because they're trying to ensure that they have a say, but however, they're trying not to violate the one China that US and UN have established. And also, it's known for the Taiwan miracle. Semiconductors, a lot of factories, a lot of research labs are in Taiwan, and that's one reason why it's been able to recover economically after war, because electronics run the world, and they've been at the forefront of trying to do some research and trying to produce a lot of the semiconductors needed for today's electronics. Now, quick history. I'm not going to read off the entire line, but you can understand this, and looking at the graph below, Taiwan has changed hands among multiple foreign governments over the centuries. And also, it was part of Qing dynasty, and it was part of Japan. But you see this? That's the Republic of China flag. If you saw earlier on the first slide, the red and yellow flag, that's the mainland China flag. One big talking point for Taiwan has been, we were never part of the People's Republic of China. But I also need to mention a rough, sad point. From 1945 until 1987, it was under martial law. It was not democratic because, like I mentioned on the Civil War slide, the nationalists ran to Taiwan thanks to U.S. naval help, and their government in exile was a dictatorship. Goofy side note, but raise your hands if you've ever heard of a movie called Malcolm X that starred Denzel Washington. Okay, yeah, yep. Okay, but however, one famous line from that movie, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. Some Taiwanese feel the same way because while they were not under communist rule, the nationalists, again, were still ruling them as a dictatorship. There was still no free speech or freedom of press. And again, just to reemphasize, democracy has been there only since the late 1980s. And reasons why China wants Taiwan. China's official statement is that Taiwan is a renegade province and is for reunification. For Taiwan, many people are thinking the Chinese Civil War never got finished because, again, they never signed an official treaty or official end to the war. The nationalists ran to Taiwan, and for about opposition status because right now Taiwan is undergoing like a balancing act politically. They're autonomous, but they're not officially independent. Some people are wanting independence, and that has concerned a lot of people. And then also, just to emphasize, Russia and Ukraine, similar things. For better and for worse, China and Taiwan have historical ties of legacy. They are a democracy, and even though, like I said, there were, under martial law from 1945 to 1987, it is a democracy today. Industry and access, like I mentioned, semiconductors. If having access to semiconductor research labs and factories means a very big point in the global economy, and then control the sea access. Russia, a lot of people have been claiming, and I believe there is a lot of credibility, that after Ukraine, they will try to retake either Poland or try to go further into the Baltics. While China does not want to directly control its neighbors, understand if it controls Taiwan, it has a foothold into water space and into airspace. And if you control water space and airspace around your neighbors, that affects their interests. Now, I also want to emphasize, right now, China is supporting Russia, Taiwan is supporting Ukraine, but it is mixed support. What you see here is what we call a yin-yang symbol. It's a symbol in Chinese philosophy that emphasizes that there is fluidity and things go in cycle, and also there is neither total darkness nor total light. There's always a little bit of light in darkness and always a little bit of darkness in light. And I want to emphasize, there is majority, but there's not 100% support from the sides. Let me go further. For the mixed support, to say again, China's providing majority but not 100% support, yin-yang. Normal trade. China still continues to trade with Russia and other things, and especially buying Russian petroleum. That still goes on. Visa-free tourism. China and Russia, right now, their people can go across the border with just a regular passport. They don't need any special paperwork for either a day trip or even up to a 30-day vacation. And it's actually quite common now for Russians or Chinese to go across each other's borders for either sightseeing or shopping. And then what I mean by dual-use parts. China is not like Iran or North Korea providing a whole military system to Russia, but however, parts like wires, gears, or other things what could be used for a civilian thing, such as a refrigerator or a dishwasher or a television, it could also be used for a drone. Furthermore, this story I saw of Russian advisement, I saw this on CNN. The Chinese military has drastically improved over the last few decades, but however, it hasn't had any real-world combat experience for traditional warfare since 1979. Russia, according to CNN, was providing some advisement to help their paratroopers because it's not just, hey, send up an airplane and then send somebody down in a parachute. It also involves a lot of coordination with weather. It also has to involve a lot of coordination with logistics and safety. So from CNN, there's alleged Russian military support. And then some Chinese individuals fought for Russia as mercenaries, and some are in Ukrainian POW camps. If you look on Kyiv Independent or a few other media sources, it mentions some interviews with those Chinese prisoners of war. However, like I was saying, yin and yang, there is minority support. China still also trades with Ukraine. They could have cut off trade, they could have imposed their own sanctions, but they still continue to trade with Ukraine. And then in 2025, off of X, formerly known as Twitter, and off of regular public channels, they actually sent a congratulatory message on Ukraine's Independence Day. President Zelensky did publicly acknowledge it, but however, I wouldn't blame him for rolling his eyes in private thinking, WTF. Yep. And then I also want to mention, there's been some anecdotes of individual support. I saw a Guardian, which is a British newspaper report, about a small number of Chinese who are doing support duties, such as they are operating businesses when other people have fled, and some that are selling items over to Ukrainian troops. There's also one story that I saw from Bloomberg in which one anti-Xi dissident from mainland China died fighting for the Ukrainian International Legion and asked to be buried in the Republic of China's colors. And then, for sake of demographics, there are some Slavic women who go to China based upon the current gender imbalance of more women in Russia and Ukraine and Slavic nations, and an imbalance of too many men in China based upon the one-child policy. Some Chinese men who are married to Slavic women have been trying to help bring their in-laws over. To clarify, a regular Ukrainian or anti-Putin Russian cannot go to China saying, I would like asylum or refuge based upon political beliefs. But again, based upon marriage and citizenship, that has been a side and backdoor way for some a small number of Ukrainians and Russians to get into China. And I also want to emphasize yin and yang. Taiwan is providing majority, but not 100% support for Ukraine. Just to clarify, you can look on a lot of Taiwan military media and civilian media. There have been some Taiwan soldiers who have voluntarily gone to Ukraine, fought, and died in their international legion. Furthermore, they're continuing to provide a lot of aid. A few examples include vehicles, ambulances, non-combat vehicles, food, first aid, tech. They still continue to do that. And also, as you can see in this picture, there's still ongoing diplomatic support. A lot of politicians from Taiwan and Ukraine still continue to meet and talk about for collaborative efforts. And to understand, Taiwan has multiple political parties now since they've transitioned to democracy. The center and left-leaning parties such as DPP, the New Power, and a few others that I can't remember, but again, the center and left wing, they issued out public statements supporting Ukraine. However, like I was mentioning, minority support for Russia. Taiwan as an archipelago, just similar to Hawaii or Japan, just other places geographically, they have limited internal resources. They unfortunately still buy coal and petroleum from Russia because they need it in order to have fuel for their cars or, again, power for their factories. And also, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, even though they fought Communist China during the Cold War, they, as a right-wing party, have been echoing Kremlin talking points. A few examples being, oh, NATO expanded east, or oh, Ukraine provoked the war. Putin is a legitimately elected president. Again, yeah. Yes. I was emphasizing and changing and exaggerating my voice to understand what they're coming from and also how many people feel. And then also understanding some perspectives, because the current conflict and future conflict, while Taiwan's learning from Ukraine, there are notable differences. As a historical recap, Russia seized Crimea back in 2014, and they began their mainland invasion in 2022. And you have to understand something else as well. As you see on the map, much of Ukraine still remains free. And also, Ukraine is a big country because geographically it's similar to the size of Texas. And for those who have ever visited Texas or know about Texas, even though it's a U.S. state, it's still very big. It's still extremely difficult and sometimes impossible to go from east to west in one day if you follow the speed limit in your car. Yep. And then also for geography, Ukraine has a lot of arable farmland, and it's also got forests and rivers, like you can see over here, because Ukraine's agriculture is one of its biggest industries. And understanding what Russia is doing. In the military, my words, it's more of an expeditionary invasion. They are sending their forces in as a main invading force, and they are firepower focused. They've continued to launch rockets, missiles, drones, and other things into Ukraine, hitting both military and civilian targets. I also want to show you Taiwan in the next slide to understand notable differences. Timeline. Similar to sportscasters, because just like you have sportscasters such as trying to predict, let's say, a basketball game or football game score or so forth, you have also different analysts politically and militarily trying to predict when a possible action might occur. Some are saying it's going to occur early, maybe really early, like in the end of this year. Others are saying, no, it's going to happen to be in 2029 or so. But from what I've been reading online from a lot of professionals, it is the same time frame before 2030. And then also understanding as well, nautical area, because again, Taiwan is an archipelago. The South China Sea is not just a little river, it's a giant moat. And you need, like I said, a plane or boat to get across, not just like a simple ferry or a bridge. And also, strategy and doctrine are going to be different. Sun Tzu, China's ancient general, he once said, "It is best to capture a city. It is second best to destroy it. It is best to capture the enemy's forces. It is second best to destroy it." The idea of an expeditionary invasion is still possible, but however, there are other courses of action that I've been reading about from reputable sources. First and foremost, blockade. This picture that I got off of Google that was pre-existing already stated it visually. You see the line around Taiwan. If China were to use naval or merchant marine vessels to block and cut off Taiwan, they could try to starve it out because, understand, Taiwan, like I was saying earlier, has very little arable land. They have very little farmland, and they still have to import a lot of food and fuel. And then also, seizure of an outlying island. This existing picture already had Kinmen Island on there. Kinmen, even though it's off the coast of China, is technically administered by Taiwan. And just to emphasize the difference between the courses of action, who here understands or has watched mixed martial arts, the UFC? Raise your hands. Okay, thank you. As an analogy, in using combat sports terms, what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine has been striking, whether standing or on the ground. They are trying to destroy Ukraine. They are trying to get a knockout. China, it is an option, but they may try to go for a submission. Seizing an outlying island to be similar to getting a joint lock. Trying a blockade would be similar to getting a choke. And I also want to mention something else. In the military, one famous acronym is called DIME, Diplomatic, Information, Military, Economy. The US is still a major advocacy point for Taiwan. They're still trying to talk to the US government to say, don't abandon us, don't overly pursue deals with China. They're still trying to advocate. And then recently, Japan has greatly upset China because they have indicated they would support Taiwan because for them, even though there's been some rough blood from previous times, but if China controls Taiwan, it means they control water and airspace, and that would affect Japanese interests. Furthermore, information. Civil defense drills. For those of you who have traveled around, sometimes you see some really old Cold War era signs for bomb shelters, which are having old faded paint. When I visited Taiwan during Thanksgiving, I was seeing a bunch of news signs posted up for bomb shelters and other places because for them, it's a reinvigorated issue based upon what's happening in Ukraine. And if you see over here, I took this picture outside of Xingmen Station in Taiwan. Ah, yeah. Yeah, thank you for, yes. Yes. Oh, yes. And then one banner they've got up there includes blue and yellow because there is major solidarity with much of Taiwan and Ukraine. They're also continuing to learn lessons from Ukraine. I don't know all the details. However, there have been reports of, again, Taiwan trying to talk to Ukraine to learn lessons of what's happening on their battlefield. And they've been drastically increasing and improving their drone forces because they realize, along with regular weapons and regular people, they also need, again, cheap disposable drones, whether it be for reconnaissance or attack, based upon what they're seeing over there. And then, again, for improving readiness, one thing that people don't understand is Taiwan, it has been drastically trying to increase and modernize its weaponry. I've had to argue with some old-time U.S. military veterans who are saying, maybe we should give the A-10 Warthog to Taiwan or some other things. The A-10 Warthog has been around since disco. It's been around since, for some of you, since your grandparents' time. Taiwan has been trying to get up-to-date modern weaponry. And for its economy, they're continuing to hype up and they're continuing to emphasize how they are a semiconductor capital, and that if they fall to China, it will mean that a lot of the semiconductors that we take for granted in much of our consumer electronics or even our military police electronics, the supply chain would be compromised. Now, like I mentioned, I was going to ensure that all of you have question and answer time, but I do want to say a few things. One, please briefly tell us your name and describe your background as an attendee before the question. You know about me, I'd like to know more about you. Also, keep your questions related to the topics. I understand there's a lot going on in the world, but I'm trying to keep this related to here tonight because, again, we are at the Free Peoples of Russia House. I'm trying not to go too far off topic, let's say, of Latin America or the Middle East or other things because, again, staying on topic. I'm also asking something else. don't interrupt someone's term and don't exceed your time. Along with being tonight's presenter, I've been an attendee here, and when I attended a friend's speech, I unfortunately had a heckler in the audience who interrupted during my turn, and after she interrupted, unfortunately, that heckler still continued to ask question after question. I want to ensure that all of you have a chance to answer your, get your questions answered tonight, and be polite because in case there are multiple hands up, I want to make sure nobody gets skipped. Thank you all. I'm looking forward to sharing the microphone and answering your questions. Okay, 1, 2, all right. First you.
So 2 questions. So first of all, so I'm Lavashura. Yeah, and so first question. Oh yeah, I'm Lavashura. I mean, like I moved here like a year ago, and so question 1. So thinking back to like post World War II, you said about how China can blockade Taiwan. Why can't we implement something like the Berlin airlift for Taiwan?
Okay, I'll answer that one quickly. We can do that. The caveat is the Berlin airlift was a little bit simpler because you had American bases that were closer in Europe. Going back to, hold on, sorry. Going back to that slide with Taiwan. Give me a second. And there it is. There it is. Top. The top? Oh, okay. Yep. Over there. Yep. Over there. Yep, that one. Japan and South Korea, it's possible to do an airlift, but they are further away from Taiwan compared to, let's say, France or Italy was from Germany. It's possible, but again, further distance due to, and also, it's more precarious because in case we're, let's say, a crash landing or having air problems, they could safely land, let's say, a little bit outside or back in Europe. If you're stuck over the water, over in Japan or South Korea, you might be forced to turn around just because, again, fewer landing spots. And quickly ask your second one.
Also, so you mentioned about how like the American counteroffensive from South Korea pushing up to the Yalu. I just want to also say that that was also in part helped by the invasion up north behind North Korean lines as well.
Good to know. Good to know. Thank you. And then your turn next.
Hi, I'm Byron the Floor. I work on the Hill. Thank you for giving this talk. And I wanted to get your take on what things that you think the U.S. could be doing differently now that could be what the U.S. could improve on to improve deterrence against an invasion of Taiwan, or things that we could be doing differently. Or if you think that, we're doing everything perfectly now, then that's one thing. But if there's anything that you think we should improve on, I'd be interested to hear your take on it.
All right. To answer that question, a few things. One, there has to be more concise work on the economy because here's the issue. I am being partisan, but I believe that there's a grain of truth to it. If you have trademark deals in China, such as the daughter of one elected official, or if you also TikTok, even though many people like to use it and like to watch it, it's still owned by China. If you're allowing it to remain in Chinese hands, it's more like you're trying to drive a car in low gear. There has to be more consistent economic action. And I do admit the soybean deal that fell apart with China, that was a bit rough. But however, there needs to be more consistency with the economy, not just we'll do something for this, but we'll leave a loophole for that. And then what else did you ask?
So a bit more, I was just, so you'd like to see, would you go as far as saying decoupling or not quite economic decoupling?
Not economic decoupling, but I would say consistency, because if you do one thing but not another, again, like I was mentioning, you don't want to drive a car in low gear, or you don't want to put up like a speed bump when you need an actual gate. Again, you need to have consistency for that. And I would say also continue to ensure that Taiwan has access to weapons, both in multiple ways. Not only just political deals, but logistically making sure that it can get there in time. And then also, like I was saying earlier, supporting Ukraine, because we want to make sure, like Brian Kirk was saying earlier, the Lieutenant Colonel in the first deterrence slide, if we concentrate overly on Taiwan, but let's say Ukraine falls, China will still feel emboldened. We need to ensure that both Europe and Asia are both supported. Okay.
That is one conflict I've been seeing in the policy kind of different factions saying like we should focus on the Pacific versus Europe, whether that's right Europe, what it sounds like you're getting at, well, is no, they're interconnected, we need them both. Focusing on one entirely to neglecting the other isn't going to help either.
Yes, that's my individual opinion. Both need to be helped, and not helping both is going to adversely affect the other. Thank you.
Hi, good evening all. My name is Pavan. Thank you for your insights. I do have one question in case the invasion happens or some form of breach of territory happens. What tools do global economies have to restrict or hinder progress of the war, or what tools do we have? Because the supply chains, I think all the countries, majority of, I'm from Australia, so I could say that a lot of supply chains which are going through China, a lot of supply chains. I think today Canada had a free trade agreement with China about grains and what different things. And European Union, the Baltic states have their trade agreements. I want to know what tools do we have when the trade agreements are so much binding? Where do we draw a line in the sand? Which country will have to draw a line in the sand? Do you think UN breaking apart? On that side, that's my 2 cents, but I want to know your thoughts, please. I'll probably have another question.
Okay then. All right, to answer that, individual opinion, I think one, preemptively, other countries should still be trading with China, because cutting off trade right now would be shooting yourselves in the foot, economically speaking. But however, they should be trying to negotiate with other countries and finding alternate sources. For example, if you don't be dependent. If, let's say, a business in your personal life screws you, you should have an alternate to say, hey, I'll take my business elsewhere. Preemptively start looking for alternates. And two, I would say, start trying to find certain economic things that you can make do without. Because whilst I admit Russia wasn't hurt at first because the U.S. didn't really impose sanctions on oil, but however, to send a message, they started imposing sanctions on vodka and others. It made almost no dent, but it sent a message. I would be saying, again, preemptively look for alternate sources and then start escalatory measures in order to buy time, because you would eventually need to do some things, and you eventually might need to do some things that might hurt you, but maybe don't do them up front. At least escalate or do some of those little things, again, to buy time. And since one other person asked a question, I'll let you answer. Okay, excuse me. I'll let you ask one more, but I want to make sure anybody else asks afterwards.
My question is on the general side. The second question is on the general side. Do you think it is going to be end of more of pro-democracy countries popping up? Because I've seen there are a lot of uprisings in the countries where the democracy is not being practiced actively. Or so do you see China imploding itself because of this? Because I think there are economic problems inside it. Do you see? Yeah, I want to ask you. Want to know, how do you see communism? I think what has happened in Venezuela, to what has happened in Syria, to what is going to happen in Iraq, Iran, and then maybe it's some other country. I think a lot of majority of the African nations have gone through the transition lately. So do you see that? What is your thoughts on it? And then is I was asking about the financial. Do you see the Chinese yen falling or crashing when those things happen because everybody wants to make money out of the stock market? So what are your thoughts on those? Yeah, that's my last. Thank you.
Well, for the first one, for pro-democracy, like I mentioned, I was trying to keep it on topic, again, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, but I will say just in general, going off of what we say, the earlier history slide, both China and Russia overthrew their monarchs, but unfortunately, neither one, after overthrowing the monarchs, transitioned to democracy because the Republic of China was a democracy, but it was so corrupt and weak that it fell apart to communism. And again, Russia, they had a civil war after, after overthrowing the Tsar, because for democracy to exist, it's not just getting rid of a dictator. There has to be economic conditions, there has to be charismatic leadership, and there has to be stability for elections and political parties to flourish, not just chaos. And for money in case of a future Chinese invasion, I hope I'm wrong, but I see it almost like Russia. There would be initial instability, but there might be artificial propping up because the ruble dropped right after the Russian invasion. Russia was able to prop it up with sky-high interest rates along with forced internal loans. I think China would be able to experience the same thing. At first, it'll drop, but again, they'll prop it up temporarily. But as an example, you can spend money on a credit card, or you can force people to loan something. But if you can't pay it back, it'll eventually catch up to you. And who else had their hand up next? One, I think you had yours, and then I'll make sure again. Keep.
Michael, I spent about 2 years in Odessa, based in Odessa and all over Ukraine during the full-scale war as a journalist. And I met some people who were working on the development of sea-based drones. What kind of effect might the technologies Ukraine has developed to counter the Russian Navy, to what extent might they be useful for Taiwan in defending itself against China?
Yep. Simple terms, I believe it's going to be a force multiplier because similar to Russia and Ukraine, Russia has bigger, just regular resources. Drones have been a way to mitigate, hey, if we're outnumbered, we have this flying or rolling device that can do reconnaissance or attack for us. I believe it's going to be a force multiplier to say, if we don't have enough destroyers to take on Chinese ships, this can be, again, additional firepower. And then also, Taiwan has also been trying to block off its rivers and small waterways. Drones, admittedly, they can range from big size to small size, but I see them maybe not in the ocean because of the need and trying to coordinate, but I could see them as well trying to prevent China from, let's say, using the river to penetrate further into Taiwan because, like I was saying in the slide for geography, there's very few beaches, and it's very mountainous terrain. It'd be hard to get land, like D-Day style invasions, and even if you had airborne troops, fighting in the mountains or in the cities would be a nightmare because plenty of places for defenders and difficult to get resupply. And I had multiple hands raised up. I had 1, 2, 3. So, okay, all right. Sorry about that.
Okay, hi. My name is Vlad. I'm originally from Bulgaria, so I'm not skin in the game. I'm an economist, and I'm going to ask a few unpleasant economic questions. I completely agree with your initial premise that Ukraine and Taiwan are morally and ideologically positively correlated. But from a resource allocation point of view, they're negatively correlated. $1 for Ukraine is less $1 for defense of Taiwan. That's just financial reality. And that's what the United States is facing and starting to recognize that, there's a competition between the two causes, and looks like it's shifting into more Taiwan direction. Second is, we talk about kind of potential war with China. I don't know if any Americans understand our complete dependence on China for almost everything that we consume. So actual war with China is absolutely not feasible, not from a military perspective, but from a simple economic perspective. China, many people here don't understand that manufacturing is only 10% of the American GDP. Nobody here works in a factory. The Chinese manufacturing capacity is times bigger than the United States, and unfortunately, they control complete supply chains, which we don't. And the so-called decoupling, it's not even clear whether it's feasible, and it's going to take decades, if ever. And then the last thing that actually I'm very curious, again, economic question. From what I know about Taiwan, China is their biggest trading partner. The country is about 20 million, 22 million. And what I read somewhere is that 500 to 800 Taiwanese, the young professional class, actually lives and works in China. So again, I don't know if that's true or not. I'll be interested to hear from you guys. But beneath this supposed antagonism and supposed political standing, looks like the economies of the two countries are completely integrated, and the two nations on a professional level are completely integrated. So I'm not even clear about the importance of the issue from a strategic perspective. All these chips that you're talking, they're selling to China the designs that we allow them to without any problem. So anyway, those three separate questions: the trade-off between Ukraine and Taiwan, the viability of conflict with China, and the third one is the economic reality between Taiwan and China.
Let me try to quickly answer those. Bang, bang, bang. Number one, Ukraine versus Taiwan in terms of aid. You're absolutely right. There is competition. And the caveat is also the types of aid, because right now the U.S. has continued to send some older aid over to there, and Taiwan's continuing to buy newer aid. It's not just giving. Taiwan has been buying it, even admittedly with subsidization. So, and also Tsai Ing-wen, who I quoted earlier, she actually mentioned help Ukraine. So that we're still trying to help both, but however, she's saying you can still help Ukraine without and take a little bit off of Taiwan without too much effects. Number two, dependence. I would say it's partially correct, but here's the other caveat. We may be dependent on China for the supply chain, but China is still dependent on American dollars and still dependent on others, because even though it has a big export surplus, the problem is there are also multiple other partners that it's trading with who would be upset if that happened. And some U.S. companies are slowly actually leaving China now because, for example, Apple, due to China having some either pay issues or some instability issues with Foxconn, there was actually talk, I got to double check online, but however, there's talk about them trying to move some of their iPhone manufacturing to Vietnam instead. And then for your third one, well, I'm sorry, remind me again. And oh yes, thank you. There was an economics relation also between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and Ukraine, I know right now. But here's the thing: for China, it's still about control, and for them, they believe, just like Russia still invaded Ukraine, despite having trade going back and forth anyway, pre and post 2014. For China, it'd be more of the trade-off of we might lose a little aid, but since we have control, we can still work it into our favor instead of having to have diplomatic negotiators renegotiate trade agreements. But I hope those three answer your questions from my individual standpoint. And then there were a few other people. One, two, okay. You and then you.
Hey, my name is Max. I'm kind of curious how. I work in trade policy, but my question's not really related to that. My question is, it seems like the Chinese focus on Taiwan also has an impact on other kind of separatist movements in Tibet and with the Uyghurs. It seems kind of unrelated ideologically from Russia, which is seems less concerned with, say, Chechen independence anymore, or Cuban independence, or any of those other big movements that were there in the 90s. So I'm kind of curious how kind of Chinese posturing towards Taiwan affects their posturing towards other separatist movements in their West. For
the sake of separatism, I would say that I that I don't know the answer, because when it comes down to separatist movements, sometimes they're for unrelated reasons, because, like I said, for Taiwan's history, like mentioned, it was jumping between different nations under occupation, and using again that Malcolm X quote by Denzel Washington, to paraphrase it to be more precise. Taiwan didn't land on the Republic of China. The Republic of China landed on Taiwan. So a lot of those issues, a lot of those separatist movements don't really care about that, because for them, they have their own beef with their own governments. And for Russian separatism, there is talk about it, but the problem is this. Russia crushed those separatist movements violently during the 90s and during the 2000s. And also, for separatism, there has to be organization, charismatic leadership, and resources. Otherwise, a separatist with just a plain pitchfork is going to get shot down. So just to answer your question, they may not have that relations just because the other countries, they have their own different circumstances. They have their own different beefs with the governments that they dislike. And I believe you were next. Oh, you want? Okay, I'm going to let her go, and then he's got you.
Thank you. My name's Logan. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer in the Kyrgyz Republic. So I had two questions, if that's okay. So the first one is, I know that China has a couple of autonomous prefectures. Is there any way that, like, if China took over Taiwan, Taiwan would become one of those autonomous prefectures, and how much autonomy do they actually have?
When it comes to autonomous prefectures, it's, excuse me, even in wintertime you have allergies. But to answer your question, those autonomous prefectures are a little bit more of internal economic decisions as opposed to governmental decisions, because if China took over Taiwan, I think they would be trying to impose a lot more control, because, as an example, Hong Kong. When Hong Kong went back to China, they had the promise of 50 years, one China, two systems. Hong Kong people were upset because, to clarify, they did not like being a British colony, but however, they felt like China was taking away some of the internal autonomy that they had. And then also, there was a concern about others, the person next to you and a few other people are talking about economy. The Chinese economy, even though it's still strong, it's running into stagnation problems. They might revoke that autonomy and use it as a bailout, because Russia has been using involuntary loans to try to prop up its currency and try to keep its military industry going. China still has a very heavy state-owned industry, not just little like military-based stores like AFIS, but like state-owned industries. Getting to the point about autonomy, it's in name, and while they might grant a little bit of it, there won't be political autonomy, and China could take it away if they suddenly need that richer autonomous province to bail out another province or the national government. And I believe you were next, making sure everybody has their turn.
Hello, my name is Anton. I'm a political science student at George Washington University. I have more hypothetical question. What if the invasion happens right now and China tries to invade Taiwan and America intervene? What would be the military strategy? What capacities United States military has, and how fast would it be able to bring all the forces to this massive piece of water and land? And do you think it would be more defensive or offensive strategy? Would they strike inside of China? Would they destroy military bases in there, or they would just defend the land? Thank you.
Okay, to give you the answer, but you're not going to like, I don't know. The most likely plans that they have for that are probably classified. But I would say from a theoretical standpoint, what they would be trying to do is disruption, and they'd probably be, from my gut feeling and from just learning from my time in the service, they'd be trying to do more disruption over water, because, like I was saying earlier, one natural feature is the South China Sea. China can't just march troops over the border like Russia did with Ukraine. It needs boats, it needs planes in order to get its troops over there. The U.S. would probably try to assist with intercepting the troops, and also you'll be doing this in coordination probably with Taiwan or with other allied nations because, like I was saying earlier, Japan, they are not happy about China still continuing to want Taiwan, and if they can control Taiwan, that means they have a foothold into possibly affecting Japanese waters. Like I said, I don't know the actual plan. It's classified, but my theory would be it'd be to try to stop it while it's over the water or reduce it in conjunction with allies, in conjunction with Taiwan's own military, because they've been, again, improving their readiness. They've been, again, ensuring that, let's say you have paratroopers landing in the cities, make sure you use stairwells and buildings, make sure you use the rooftops to try to shoot them down early or hide, use the mountains in order to have hard rock for denial. They have also been carrying out their own defensive drills, and like I mentioned earlier, they've also been trying to deny the rivers. It's going to be a point of trying to blunt the attack and use the terrain as a theory, because while Ukraine unfortunately got partially taken over, the terrain, the mud in which a lot of trucks and tanks got stuck in, helped to blunt the attack. I think that they, again, using allies, using terrain, and again, it's theory. The actual plan would probably be classified. And do I have any other hands raised? Okay, then. I want to ask you, because you two have gone before, you and then them.
Hi, I'm Robert Lanza. I'm an engineer by training. My brother's a retired military officer, which gets me involved and interested in these sorts of talks. I had a question concerning the surrounding countries, Korea, Japan, Philippines. What is their practical, other than expressing verbal support for Taiwan, what are their practical activities that they could conduct in the event of conflict?
For the other countries, I would say, a practical effect, so a few things. One, economic. They would still try to, even though Taiwan would be surrounded, they might try to have some aid for sake of rebuilding or other things afterwards. But also the big thing is terrain, basing. Because Taiwan is surrounded by the South China Sea and because of other things, any allied forces need to have a foothold there. We already have bases in many places, but however, the fact that you have a forward base and don't have to go all the way from the U.S. over to Taiwan means a lot, because when I was over in Poland, one thing that happened was they opened up a new what's called APS, Army Prepositioned Stock. It means that it's not a full-on base with actual people, but they have pre-prepared equipment ready to go either for a training exercise or in case there's go to war. Again, instead of having to move tanks all the way from the U.S., they've got equipment ready to go. They would provide, again, basing, and again, follow-on support afterwards. And before I forget, and I want to make sure they get a second chance, intelligence is not just having our eyes on the ground or our drones. They've got insight as neighbors that could also be leveraged for intel. And then I'll go you, and then you.
So I had a question. You said something about if Russia succeeds in invading Ukraine, it's like largely thought that after Ukraine they would go after Poland. Is there a reason why they would go after countries like Ukraine and Poland, which are protected by NATO, rather than Central Asia, which used to be part of the USSR and is not protected by NATO?
That one's an easy answer, because many of those Stan countries that used to be part of the USSR, they have dictators, and those dictators are still friendly to Russia. Not all of them are, and there are some people that I've talked to, like Uber drivers who immigrated from a Stan country and others who disagree with it. But some of those dictators, like Kazakhstan, even though it's an independent country, bless you, they've still got relatively warm relations with Russia. For Russia, they would still want they want Ukraine. They would still want to go back to the West because of something that I learned in military school: history. No Western nation is innocent. Western nations have taken colonies and had their empires, but a lot of those were overseas. And then afterwards, after they lost those colonies, it was embarrassing, but they were able to slowly make peace decades or years afterwards and talk again. For Russia, they expanded by land, and for them, losing a colony or one of the Stan or one of those other countries, it's not just embarrassing, it's a security threat. So for them, even though NATO is protecting Poland for right now, for them, it's more of conquer or be conquered, even though they've got, like some warm relations with the Stan countries. And I got to double check, but I think it was like Tajikistan or other countries that are still part of the CSTO. They actually voluntarily asked for Russian troops to help put down a protest, which shows that even yep. Again, just to emphasize, they're independent in name, but however, Russia's not going to try to conquer them because, similar to Belarus, they got leaders who are receptive. Okay.
So I was kind of wondering, as someone who is, as someone like you who's kept such a close eye on this issue of cross-strait relations, what are some red flags that you would, if you saw that, you would say, okay, China is going now. Red flags that they haven't really flown before. Things like, I don't know, an abnormal movement of troops into Fujian, or, some type of bomber entering the ADIZ that hasn't been detected in there before. What are some kind of red flags that you say, this is different, this is not just escalation or saber rattling, this is it?
Okay. To answer that, I'm using both military education, and I also saw 2 episodes of a Taiwan miniseries called 0 Day Hour, which theorized a hypothetical invasion. You're laughing because you've heard of it? Okay. To clarify, I would say to clarify, a few things would be, one, use of live rather than training equipment, because one thing that the U.S. noticed before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they were putting a lot of medical equipment and a lot of live fire things, blood body bags, that you would not normally have for, let's say, a training exercise where you're using blank versus live ammunition. I would also say that for, let's say, the blockade, instead of having just ships moving in the water, if you've had ships staying stationary in the water for a long period of time, instead of just moving and pretending like, bang, bang, this is a training exercise, those would be potential red flags. And I would say for an actual seizure of an island, I don't have enough information, but I think that Taiwan would probably have their own sensors or things in place to say, hey, this is different than just a regular probe. We got, let's say, a bigger number, or there's even though radio traffic is encrypted, but let's say you had more encrypted calls than normal rather than just the basic, yes, this is me, over, how are you? Yes, this is me, over.
So, blood bags, stationary vessels, and spike and chatter.
Yes, like I said, there are multiple different signs, but off the top of my head, those would be my thoughts. Okay, do I have any other questions?
Kind of going off that last question, how would a maritime invasion compare to, say, D-Day in terms of scale? Because you mentioned the limited number of beaches in Taiwan, the limited number of kind of entry points that you would need for a large-scale invasion of both material and number of troops.
To answer your question, it would be massive, because the caveat is, again, there's very few beaches, and a lot of those are heavily defended. And then also understanding that along with all that's involved, there's got to be other things. For example, if you remember the movie Saving Private Ryan, along with just the usual, they're taking Omaha Beach. If you remember seeing in the movie how there were some big metal spikes on the beaches and so forth, the Allies got lucky. They came in at a low tide, because had the tide been higher, those spikes might have penetrated the vessels and they would have sank in the water. And then also, I got to remember, shame on me for not knowing more, but I think it was Operation Overlord or something else. Allies diverted a lot of German troops, because even though D-Day, the breaches were defended, I think they were trying to fake an invasion at Calais, if memory serves. Yes. And there'd be those considerations, because understanding D-Day was extraordinarily bloody, and even though the Allies took it, they still had somewhat favorable conditions, and it was still a hard-fought battle. China, even with their numbers, it's going to be even worse, because again, terrain conditions, and Taiwan's been heavily preparing, and if memory serves, there was very little aerial involvement over on D-Day. I think America was unable to really get airstrikes beaches, but it was cloudy, but also by the same token, the Germans had trouble doing the same. They can be sure that there's going to be a joint operation, combined arms. If the beaches are under attack, there's going to be naval gunfire or drones or airplanes supporting the people on the ground. Yep. Any other questions? Sure. Okay, one last question then.
Thank you all. So given I think China is known for its drone swarms. I think there are a lot of public shows about drone swarms. I think Ukraine war has taught us that the drone warfare is one of those in the it's the latest version of warfare. How do you see that evolving while in China and Taiwan war? How do you see the submarines? Also, yeah, so autonomous submarines plus submarines. Those things are pretty much for storybooks, but it's actually real life incidents.
Evolution of drone warfare. I'll go ahead and answer that one as a final question. One thing I've noticed for the Ukraine side, drone warfare is going down to the tactical level. For those of you who don't have a military background, we talk about the tactical level, which is like the people on the ground, normally led by junior officers. We talk about the operational level, where you're still on the ground, but since you're controlling large formations, they're led by lieutenant colonels or full colonels in the hundreds or thousands. And they have the strategic level, the people in the Pentagon who do a lot of things. Getting to point, Ukraine, from my talks with Ukrainian soldiers, they've been using drone warfare at the tactical level. It's not just a colonel that says you go through me, we can get this big drone to do reconnaissance or do a bombing mission or a dedicated airstrike. You have junior people that are doing that now. I'd have to look up like some military journals or do other things, but it's my hope and thought that for the West and for other nations, they start implementing drone warfare at the junior level, at the tactical level, because in basic training, people learn about the basics, how to move, how to shoot a rifle, how to throw a grenade, how to man a radio or operate a radio. If the West is wise, they'll be learning, hey, here's how we can use drones at the junior level, because right now they're working on trying to get the books done. They're trying to work on getting all the supplies and everything else done. But however, for a future Taiwan invasion, they're going to be trying to, again, make sure that junior people have access and can use it, not just mid-level or high-level people. Okay. Did you have one? Did you have anything or no? From what I've heard, they did in the beginning because I want to make sure that I'll answer that, but I want to make sure somebody else gets a chance as well. But I'll quickly answer it. Ukraine in the beginning was still operating off a Soviet doctrine in which the officers had all the power and the non-commissioned or the mid-level enlisted were more like higher rank, like more senior privates as opposed to being internal managers. From what I'm reading and seeing on the ground, they're becoming more westernized in which they're empowering not only the officers, but their enlisted leaders on the ground to have more managerial authority for the sake of control and operations. And just to make sure, did I have any other hands up? Are you okay with him? Okay, keep it, like I said, I'll answer it because he was gracious enough. I see them potentially doing that. The caveat is that it's still going to take some time because almost all militaries know drone warfare. But however, it's being able to adapt it for Taiwan-specific territory and adapting it to the tactics, operations and strategy that China will use, because it's one thing to be able to fly a drone, it's being able to do it as part of an operation or doing it as part of an attack, not just for movement. And then did you have your hand up, sir?
My name is Lanny, and I'm a Lutheran pastor, and I have a sister living near Kiev. And my question is a little bit outside your scope, so you can feel free to pass on it if you wish. How might our administration's recent actions and threats in Venezuela, Greenland, and Iran be perceived in Taiwan, Ukraine, Russia, and China? How might that be affecting it?
Side note, I am single, but however, my brother is married, and my brother's spouse's mom is actually a retired Lutheran pastor. Okay, but to answer your question about how China, Russia, Taiwan, and Ukraine are perceiving what's happening in Venezuela and so forth, I would simply say, what the fuck? WTF? Because to clarify, okay, here's the thing. While the current administration hasn't really been warm towards trying to restart or help aid Ukraine, but however, Venezuela was a Russian ally, and right now, to my knowledge, Putin wasn't really on bad terms. I think it was still on okay terms with Maduro. Right now, I'm thinking all four nations are just thinking WTF because they don't understand what's going on, or they may be thinking, is Trump trying to become like a Xi or Putin trying to carve out a hemisphere of imperialism? But however, just to answer your question, they're just thinking, what gives just because this is a chaotic situation? And again, Maduro is a Putin supporter, but however, Trump isn't helping Ukraine right now. Okay. Yes. Okay. And did you have one, or are you good?
My name is Drew, and we research sanctions indeed. So there's this Sanctions Act. I mean, just what's your sort of take on how effective? I mean,
happy to answer that one because I actually discussed this with fellow attendees at the last Ukraine Action Summit. Sanctions are partially effective. We need to clarify, from individual perspective, sanctions are similar to land or sea mines. They themselves will not destroy a country. But however, when you place a land mine or a sea mine, it means you've denied the route for a military or civilian movement into an area. Russia has ways to circumvent it. Russia has ways to get around it. But however, again, it still causes a lot of disruption for normal operations, because if a road is mined or if the sea route is mined, you don't go down that route unless you want to get blown up. And then similar to the economic route, don't go down that normal route unless you want to have something get denied. You have to, again, it's partially effective. It will not end it alone, but we still need to have it. But understanding it's not going to end a war, but it's going to, again, reduce the ability and reduce the normal routes or actions that you can normally take, and forces somebody to do a workaround. Thank you all. Thank you all. You all come from different backgrounds. I'm hoping to have been able to answer a lot and present to you a very good piece about what's going on, not just here, but overseas, and understanding in foreign relations, it's not just the relations between two countries. Sometimes multiple countries are involved and have ties.